The morning mist rose from the Tiber, shrouding the ancient city of Rome in a thick, eerie blanket. It was May 6th, 1527, and the air was thick with fear and tension. Inside the papal palace, Pope Clement VII knelt on the cold stone floor, his eyes closed, praying desperately for a miracle. The city was about to be invaded, and the Pope, usually a man of indecision, was now utterly paralyzed by fear. Suddenly, the sound of distant shouting and the clatter of armor broke through the silence. Clement VII's attendants rushed in, their faces pale with terror. "Your Holiness, the imperial troops are here. They are scaling the walls," one of them cried. The Pope's eyes snapped open, and he stared at the man as if he were seeing a ghost. He had heard the rumors, of course, but now the threat was real, and it was at his doorstep. Outside, the mist began to clear, revealing the formidable ranks of the Duke of Bourbon's army. The imperial troops, a mix of German Landsknecht and Spanish soldiers, were a ragged, hungry, and determined force. They had marched through the Alps, braving torrential rains and snowstorms, driven by dreams of gold and plunder. Now they were ready to storm the city. On the city walls, the defenders were already engaged in a desperate battle. Benvenuto Cellini, a young goldsmith, stood on the ramparts, his heart pounding in his chest. He held an arquebus, a heavy and cumbersome weapon, but one of the few things standing between the invaders and the city. The fog was thick, making it hard to see, but the sounds of battle were unmistakable. The clashing of metal, the cries of the wounded, and the roar of the imperial troops were all around him. "Look out!" one of his companions shouted, and Cellini turned just in time to see a group of Landsknecht scaling the wall. He raised his arquebus and fired, the gunpowder bursting in a flash of light and smoke. The bullet hit its mark, and one of the attackers tumbled back, his body falling into the mist below. The fighting was brutal. The defenders, though outnumbered, fought with all their might. Cellini's hands shook as he reloaded his weapon, his mind racing. The Duke of Bourbon, a formidable leader, was at the forefront of the attack, rallying his troops and urging them on. But the mist played tricks on everyone, and at one moment, the fog cleared just enough for Cellini to see a figure standing out from the rest. Without hesitation, he aimed and fired. A moment later, the Duke of Bourbon fell, his body hitting the ground with a thud. The loss of their leader momentarily stunned the imperial troops, but the respite was short-lived. The walls were soon breached, and the invaders poured into the city. The streets of Rome, once filled with the sounds of daily life, were now a scene of chaos and terror. The citizens, panic-stricken, fled for their lives, many heading towards the safety of Castel Sant'Angelo, the massive fortress that loomed over the city. Clement VII, still on his knees in the oratory, heard the cries of the people and the clatter of the invaders' boots. His attendants, tears streaming down their faces, begged him to leave. "Your Holiness, you must come with us. The castle is the only safe place left," they pleaded. Reluctantly, the Pope rose, his robes trailing behind him as he made his way to the passageway that connected the papal palace to the castle. The passage was a narrow stone walkway that ran above the streets. As Clement VII and his attendants hurried along, they could see the chaos below. The Landsknecht, their faces twisted with rage, were butchering anyone in their path. Priests, citizens, and even children were not spared. The Pope's attendants held up his long robes to help him run faster, and Paolo Giovo, one of the attendants, threw his purple cloak over the Pope's head and shoulders to hide him from the invaders. Finally, they reached the castle, and the heavy portcullis was dropped, sealing them inside. Clement VII, the spiritual leader of Christendom, was now a prisoner in his own fortress, surrounded by the screams of the dying and the chaos of the sack of Rome. Outside the walls, the city burned, and the invaders ransacked every corner of Rome. They broke into churches, desecrated holy relics, and raped and tortured the citizens. The palaces of the cardinals were looted, and the streets ran red with blood. The sack of Rome, one of the most brutal and infamous events in history, had begun. Inside the castle, Clement VII, a broken man, watched as the city he was meant to protect was destroyed. The Pope's prayers had not been answered, and the world he knew was falling apart. The only thing left to do was to wait, and hope that somehow, someway, the nightmare would end. The sack of Rome left Pope Clement VII a changed man. Once known for his honesty and understanding, he became suspicious and devious. The humiliation he suffered was unprecedented, and news of the city's fall spread rapidly across Europe. The last time Rome had faced such a disaster was during the Dark Ages, when the Vandals and Visigoths had invaded. Even Emperor Charles V, who was responsible for the attack, ordered his court into mourning, though many saw this as mere hypocrisy. Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer, saw the sack of Rome as God's punishment for the corruption in the Church. Erasmus, the famous humanist, remarked, "Truly, this is not the ruin of one city, but of the world." Clement VII and thousands of others were trapped in the Castel Sant'Angelo for 5 weeks. The conditions were dire heat, hunger, and fear were their constant companions. On June 7th, Charles V allowed the siege to be lifted, but only after Clement VII signed a treaty that stripped the papacy of much of its territory. The Pope lost control of key cities like Civitavecchia, Ostia, Parma, Modena, and Piacenza, reducing the papal states to a fraction of their former size. Despite this, Clement VII was not allowed to leave the Castel Sant'Angelo. He remained a virtual prisoner, and the city of Rome was in ruins. Plague and hunger ravaged the remaining citizens, and the once proud city was now a desolate wasteland. The imperial troops, who were not paid, grew restless and threatened to break into the Castel Sant'Angelo and kill the Pope. On the night of December 7th, Clement VII finally escaped, disguised as a servant. He and his retinue fled north, carrying strips of gold sewn into their clothes, which had been made from melted-down papal treasures. After several days of travel, they arrived at the Episcopal Palace in Orvieto, a remote and dilapidated place. The palace was in ruins, and Clement VII, once celebrated for his beauty, now grew a beard and mustache, looking more haunted and scheming than ever. In Orvieto, Clement VII tried to continue his duties as Pope, but he faced new challenges. Henry VIII of England sent a delegation to seek a divorce from his wife, Catherine of Aragon. Clement VII was caught in a difficult position. He didn't want to lose Henry as an ally, but Catherine was the aunt of Emperor Charles V, who now held the papacy's fate in his hands. Clement prevaricated, and the English delegation returned home, bringing with them a grim report of the Pope's circumstances. This only added to Henry's doubts about the Pope's authority. Clement VII had not only lost territory, but also his power base in Florence. He had appointed Cardinal Passerini to rule Florence and mentor the 2 young Medici heirs, Ippolito and Alessandro. However, Passerini was ineffective, and the Medici were deeply resented in the city. When the news of Rome's fall reached Florence, the citizens rebelled. They seized the Palazzo della Signoria, and during the chaos, a heavy wooden bench was thrown from a window, breaking Michelangelo's famous statue, David. The arm was later saved and restored, but the joins are still visible today. Niccolò Caponi, an anti-Medici leader, took control of the city. The Medici were expelled, and their symbols were destroyed. The young Caterina de' Medici, the only legitimate Medici heir, was held hostage in a convent. The city's new administration, led by Francesco Carducci, worked to undo the Medici's influence and establish a more democratic government. By the summer of 1528, Clement VII felt it was safe to return to Rome. His main concern was now Florence. Without the city, the Medici would be powerless. Clement VII needed a strong ally to help him reclaim Florence, and he turned to Emperor Charles V. They signed the Treaty of Barcelona, and Clement VII agreed to crown Charles V as Holy Roman Emperor. In return, Charles V promised to help restore Medici rule in Florence. The French, under King Francis I, posed another threat. After his defeat and capture by Charles V, Francis I was determined to avenge himself. However, his sons were still held hostage, so he had to be cautious. In 1529, Francis I and Charles V signed the Treaty of Cambrai, which allowed Francis I to regain his sons in exchange for a large ransom. Charles V then ordered his commander, the Prince of Orange, to assist the Pope. The Prince of Orange led a large army into Tuscany and began laying siege to Florence. The city was well prepared, thanks to Michelangelo, who had been appointed to fortify the city walls. He extended the walls to include the hill of San Miniato, a strategic point for the besieging army. Despite the siege, the citizens of Florence refused to surrender. They were encouraged by the brave actions of Francesco Ferrucci, a military officer who led night raids to bring supplies into the city. The siege lasted for months. As winter turned to spring and then summer, the people of Florence suffered from hunger and plague. Ferrucci decided to gather a volunteer army to break the siege. He succeeded in raising 3,000 foot soldiers and 500 cavalry. However, the Prince of Orange learned of Ferrucci's plan and ambushed him near Pistoia. In the ensuing battle, Ferrucci and his men were overwhelmingly defeated. Ferrucci was captured and mortally wounded, and the Prince of Orange was also killed in the fighting. In February 1530, Clement VII traveled to Boulogne to crown Charles V as Holy Roman Emperor. The ceremony, steeped in tradition, marked a significant moment in European history. Despite the coronation, the siege of Florence continued. The city's resolve was tested, and the people faced increasing hardship, but the siege would eventually end, and the Medici would return to power. The siege of Florence left the city in ruin. People were starving, and the streets were filled with cries for the Medici, who were seen as the only hope for relief. After months of suffering, the city's leaders decided to surrender to the enemy. The population was terrified, barricading themselves in cellars and churches, fearing the worst from the invading soldiers. However, thanks to Pope Clement VII's intervention, the city was spared a massacre. Instead, the Medici took control once again, with the new Gonfaloniere being imprisoned and some former supporters of the Republic, like the Strozzi family, exiled. With Medici rule re-established, Clement VII sent his young son, Alessandro, to take charge of the city. Alessandro was given the title of head of the Florentine Republic, a title that gave him significant power but also some ambiguity. The main ruling councils were kept, but Alessandro had a seat on all of them, and was the Gonfaloniere for life. This marked the end of any real democracy in Florence. Alessandro quickly started to make changes. Within 2 years, the old signoria was abolished, and the famous bell that called the people to meetings was thrown from the tower and smashed to pieces. Alessandro ordered the pieces to be melted down and made into medals celebrating the Medici family. The symbolism was clear. The old republican system was gone, and the Medici were in charge. To ensure stability, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, insisted that Florence needed consistent rule. Clement VII, now quite ill, agreed and gave Alessandro the title of Duke of the Florentine Republic. This was a big step, as the title was hereditary, meaning the Medici would rule the city for generations. The last traces of democracy were gone, and Florence was now a duchy. Clement VII, despite his illness, was determined to secure the Medici's future. He arranged for Alessandro to marry Charles V's daughter, Margaret, and for his niece, Caterina de' Medici, to marry Francis I's son, Henry. These marriages were meant to strengthen alliances with both the Holy Roman Empire and France. The wedding of Caterina and Henry was a grand affair, with lavish banquets and festivities, but it came at a high cost to Florence, which had to pay for it through new taxes. Clement VII's reign, however, was marked by some significant failures. One of the most notable was his handling of Henry VIII of England's request for a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Henry VIII, frustrated by the Pope's delays, broke from the Roman Catholic Church, leading to the establishment of the Church of England. This was a major blow to the Catholic Church and a significant moment in the Protestant Reformation. Clement VII's health continued to decline, and he died in 1534. His death was met with little mourning in Rome, where he was widely reviled. His rule had been marked by ruthlessness and poor timing, and he had failed to prevent some of the greatest calamities of his reign, including the sack of Rome and the division of Christendom. Alessandro de' Medici, now the Duke of Florence, was a controversial figure. He was of mixed race, with a dark complexion and frizzy hair, and he was often seen as uncouth and ill-educated. Despite this, he had some political skills and was known for his generosity to the poor. He would often listen to the grievances of the citizens and drop in unannounced on his political supporters to get their opinions. However, his rule was also marked by tyranny. He took away weapons from the citizens, demolished an ancient convent to build a fortress, and used his power to ruin those who opposed him. His sexual behavior was also a source of scandal, and he was known for his numerous escapades. In 1535, a delegation of leading citizens went to the Emperor Charles V to complain about Alessandro's rule. They were led by Cardinal Ippolito de' Medici, who was jealous of his cousin's power. However, Ippolito died suddenly on the way, likely poisoned on Alessandro's orders. When the delegation reached the emperor, they presented their case, but to their surprise, Francesco Guicciardini, who was supposed to support them, argued in favor of Alessandro. The emperor, who wanted stability in Florence, was not interested in deposing Alessandro. He even brought several exiled families back to Florence as a gesture, but life in the city remained unchanged. In the summer of 1536, Charles V arrived in Florence with his daughter Margaret for Alessandro's wedding. The festivities were grand, but they did nothing to change the oppressive rule of Alessandro. The people of Florence continued to suffer under his tyranny, and the city's future looked uncertain. Lorenzino de' Medici was a complex and volatile character. Though his nickname Lorenzino meant Little Lorenzo, it also suggested that he was a person of little consequence. This couldn't be further from the truth. Lorenzino was ambitious and determined to prove himself. He was a Medici, descending from the same lineage as the great Cosimo Pater Patrii, but his mother was from the Soderini family, known for their democratic ideals. This mix of backgrounds added to his contradictory personality. Lorenzino grew up in Rome, where he gained a deep knowledge of humanist studies. He could quote Cicero and Machiavelli and loved to show off his learning. However, he also had a wild side. When drunk, he would decapitate ancient statues in the Roman Forum, claiming he was striking a blow against imperial power. His antics eventually caught the attention of Pope Clement VII, who banished him to Florence. In Florence, Lorenzino soon became friends with Alessandro, Duke of Florence. They were a wild pair, but Lorenzino's feelings for Alessandro were far from friendly. He saw Alessandro as an ignorant, illegitimate ruler who had all the power and money, while Lorenzino, a true Medici, had nothing. This resentment grew into deep hatred. Alessandro was known for his cruel and selfish actions. He even poisoned his own cousin, Cardinal Ippolito de' Medici. This act pushed Lorenzino over the edge. He began to see himself as Brutus, who had assassinated Julius Caesar, the tyrant who had despoiled Rome. Lorenzino decided that by killing Alessandro, he would become a hero and the rightful ruler of Florence. Lorenzino's plan was clever. He told Alessandro about a beautiful but virtuous woman named Caterina Soderini Ginori. Lorenzino convinced Alessandro that seducing Caterina would prove his manhood. Unknown to Alessandro, Caterina was Lorenzino's sister. Lorenzino arranged a meeting between Alessandro and Caterina, but it was a trap. On the night of Twelfth Night, Alessandro arrived at Lorenzino's house, where he was supposed to meet Caterina. He waited, but instead of Caterina, Lorenzino and a hired assassin named Scorin, Concolo, entered the room. They attacked Alessandro, and after a brutal struggle, they killed him. Lorenzino covered the body with a blanket and pinned a note to it, quoting Virgil, "Love of one's country and great desire for glory shall conquer." He then fled the city, believing he would be hailed as a hero and the new ruler of Florence. However, things didn't go as planned. The body was not discovered immediately, and when it was, the city's leaders, including Cardinal Cibo and Francesco Guicciardini, decided to keep the murder a secret to avoid a potential uprising. They feared that if the news of Alessandro's death became public, the city would fall into chaos, and either the Emperor Charles V or Pope Paul III would take control. The question of who should rule Florence next was a critical one. Some suggested Alessandro's illegitimate son, Giulio, but others, including Guicciardini, favored the young Cosimo de' Medici. Cosimo was the son of a famous military hero and had a strong claim to the Medici lineage. To ensure Cosimo's selection, Guicciardini orchestrated a plan. He sent word to Cosimo to come to Florence and arranged for the city's guards to chant Cosimo's name, creating the impression that the people wanted him as their ruler. The city council, influenced by the guards' chants, voted for Cosimo to become the new Duke of Florence. Cosimo, who was just 17 years old, took up residence in the Palazzo Medici. He was a serious and disciplined young man, more pragmatic than his romantic father. Although he respected Guicciardini's advice at first, he soon began to rely on his own judgment. Cosimo's rule was quickly tested when Filippo Strozzi led an army of exiles in a march on Florence. Strozzi expected the Florentines to rise up against Cosimo, but they did not. Instead, the Florentine militia, led by Alessandro Vitelli, defeated Strozzi's forces at Montemerio. The exiles were captured and punished severely, with many executed or imprisoned. Cosimo's rule became increasingly autocratic. He eliminated his enemies, including Lorenzino, who was later assassinated in Venice. Back in Florence, Cosimo established a strong and stable government. He dismissed Guicciardini, who retired to his villa and wrote his famous History of Italy, a valuable account of the era. Cosimo, however, adopted a more Machiavellian approach, which was necessary to maintain his power and ensure the survival of Florence in the politically turbulent 16th century. Cosimo's rule marked a significant change for Florence. Unlike the leaders who came before him, he didn't just lead the city, he ruled it. He saw himself as a sovereign ruler, supported by a professional bureaucracy instead of the old party system. This shift might seem small, but it was a big deal. Before Cosimo, the city was run by factions constantly fighting for power. Under Cosimo, the government became a strong, centralized machine, and the ruling families worked together to support him, competing only to serve him better. Cosimo's approach was cold and calculated. He wasn't afraid to instill fear to maintain control, and he didn't care much about being popular. The people of Florence, tired and disillusioned after years of turmoil, accepted his rule. The old republican spirit was gone, and Cosimo's autocracy took its place. One of Cosimo's first challenges was his relationship with the powerful Emperor Charles V. Cosimo was smart enough to see that he had to play along for now. He even tried to marry Charles V's daughter, but Charles had other plans. Instead, Cosimo married Eleanor of Toledo, the daughter of Don Pedro of Toledo, Charles V's viceroy in Naples. Eleanor brought a huge dowry, and their wedding in 1539 was a grand affair, with the people of Florence enjoying free cakes and wine. After the wedding, Cosimo moved from the Palazzo Medici to the Palazzo Vecchio, the city's center of government. This move allowed him to be closer to his administration and to the guards who protected him. He worked tirelessly, often rising before dawn to study reports and manage the city's affairs. He believed in keeping detailed records and often initiated surveys and censuses to understand his domain better. His efforts led to significant improvements, such as the construction of canals for irrigation and navigation, and the revival of the universities at Florence and Pisa, where he encouraged the study of sciences. Cosimo's ambitions extended beyond Florence. He wanted to turn the city into a sea power and expand its territory. He successfully conquered Siena, a long-standing enemy, and later purchased the island of Elba from Genoa. He also developed the port city of Livorno, making it a hub for international trade and religious tolerance. Despite his focus on ruling, Cosimo had a personal side. He was a devoted family man and took great care of his children with Eleanor. He even supervised the layout of the Boboli Gardens, which became a beautiful green space in the heart of Florence. However, life in the ducal palace wasn't always harmonious. Eleanor, a proud Spanish aristocrat, found the Palazzo Vecchio too small and noisy, so she purchased the grand Palazzo Pitti and transformed it into a fitting home for a duchess. Cosimo also continued the Medici tradition of patronage. He commissioned works from artists like Cellini, who created a powerful bronze statue of Perseus, symbolizing Florence's victory over its enemies and the triumph of order over chaos. Despite his cold and reserved nature, Cosimo had a softer side, especially with Cellini, who seemed to break through his reserve. In the end, Cosimo's rule was a turning point for Florence. He transformed the city from a republic into a stable and efficient duchy, setting the stage for its future as a powerful and influential state. His legacy was one of strength, order, and a renewed sense of purpose for a city that had seen too much turmoil.